The water moves in long, dark swells beneath a sky that barely distinguishes itself from the sea. HMS Erebus leads, her bow cutting through water the color of slate, her sails drawing what wind the Arctic offers. Behind her, HMS Terror follows in formation, both ships moving north through Lancaster Sound. The men on deck work with the efficiency of experienced sailors, adjusting canvas, monitoring the horizon, recording observations in logs that will one day be read by people searching for answers. The light here is different. It slants low even at midday, stretching shadows across the deck, giving everything a quality of perpetual dusk. The air carries a sharpness that announces the presence of ice before it becomes visible, and soon enough, it does become visible. Small pieces first, floating past the hull like debris from some distant frozen shore, then larger fragments. Then fields of white spreading across the water's surface, narrowing the channels through which the ships can pass. The officers study their charts. They consult with one another. The ships press forward, seeking open leads, navigating through gaps in the ice that grow narrower with each passing day. The sound changes. The constant rush of water against wood becomes something harder, a grinding and scraping that vibrates through the timbers. The ice is thickening. The water is becoming solid. By September 1846, movement stops. The ice closes around both ships like a hand slowly tightening. The hulls groan under pressure. The masts stand motionless against a sky that offers neither guidance nor mercy. The men can walk from Erebus to Terror across the frozen surface, their boots crunching on ice that extends to the horizon in every direction. There is no open water, there is no passage. There is only white and cold and silence so complete that a man can hear his own heartbeat. The Arctic has taken them. But to understand what this means, it is necessary to return to where the journey began, to the docks of London in the spring of 1845, when the expedition departed under the gaze of an empire that believed itself capable of anything. Sir John Franklin was 59 years old when he accepted command of the expedition. He had spent his life in service to the Royal Navy, had survived previous Arctic voyages, had earned a reputation for endurance and determination. The Admiralty selected him to complete the Northwest Passage, to find the route that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific through the Arctic archipelago, to accomplish what generations of explorers had attempted and failed. The ships assigned to him were the finest available. Erebus and Terror had already proven themselves in Antarctic waters under James Clark Ross. For this voyage, they were reinforced with iron plating to withstand the pressure of pack ice. Steam engines were installed, powered by locomotive boilers, giving the ships the ability to move independent of wind. The hulls were insulated against cold. The interiors were fitted with heating systems that circulated warm air through iron pipes. These were not fragile vessels venturing into the unknown. These were instruments of technological confidence, designed to overcome the environment through engineering. The provisions reflected the same philosophy. 3 years of supplies were loaded aboard flour, sugar, salt meat, chocolate, lemon juice to prevent scurvy, and thousands of tins of preserved food from the firm of Stephen Goldner. The tinned provisions represented modern innovation, a way to carry meat and vegetables that would remain edible for the duration of the voyage. 8,000 tins were stowed in the holds, enough to sustain 129 men through whatever the Arctic demanded. The expedition departed on the 19th of May, 1845. Crowds gathered to watch the ships leave. Newspapers celebrated the venture. The men aboard wrote letters to their families, expressing confidence and anticipation. They carried with them libraries of books, scientific instruments, dress uniforms for the formal dinners that would mark their eventual success. They believed they were prepared. They were not prepared for immobility. The first winter in the ice passed with discipline intact. The ships had been designed for this. The heating systems functioned. The provisions were distributed according to schedule. The officers maintained routines, scientific observations, theatrical performances, educational lectures for the men. The darkness lasted months, the sun disappearing below the horizon and refusing to return, but the crews had experienced polar winters before. They understood that survival meant structure, that structure meant sanity, that sanity meant maintaining the rhythms of civilization even when civilization itself lay thousands of miles away. The sun did not simply set, it withdrew. Day after day the horizon remained empty, a line of iron grey where light should have been. Men stood on deck, longer than necessary, staring south, as if the act of looking might summon warmth. Inside, the air smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. Conversations grew shorter, laughter came less often. The routines continued: lectures, card games, measured rations, but they acquired a mechanical quality, performed not out of hope, but out of obligation. Time loosened its structure. Weeks passed without distinction. In the darkness, thought turns inward, and inward is not always a safe direction. Summer came, but the ice did not release them. The ships remained locked in place, surrounded by pressure ridges that rose and fell like frozen waves. Hunting parties went out onto the ice, returning with seals and the occasional bear, supplementing the provisions, providing fresh meat that the men craved. There was still hope. There was still expectation that the next summer would bring release, that the ice would fracture and open leads to navigable water. It did not. The second winter was harder. The cold seemed more penetrating. The darkness felt heavier. Men began to weaken in ways that could not be attributed to cold alone. Gums swelled and bled, teeth loosened, joints ached with a deep, persistent pain. The symptoms were familiar to anyone who had studied naval medicine. Scurvy was appearing, despite the lemon juice that had been included precisely to prevent it. Modern analysis would later suggest additional factors. The tinned provisions, sealed hastily by Goldner to meet the Admiralty's deadline, may have been contaminated with lead from the solder used to seal the cans. Lead accumulates in the body slowly, affecting cognition, causing fatigue, impairing judgment. The men consuming these provisions day after day may have been poisoning themselves without knowing it, their minds clouding even as their bodies weakened. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. He died in his cabin, the lamp burning low beside his cot, the air close with the smell of oil and iron. Outside, the ice pressed faintly against the hull, a distant groan that never ceased. The officers gathered in silence. No speeches were made. There was no horizon to gesture toward, no promise of movement. The expedition had been built around his authority, around the assumption that leadership could impose order on uncertainty. Now the man at the center of that belief lay still beneath a naval blanket. Word moved quietly through the ship. Men removed their caps. Some stared at the deck, as if waiting for the wood itself to offer instruction. The cause was not recorded in detail. He had led the expedition for 2 years without completing the passage, without freeing the ships, without finding a way forward. Command passed to Captain Francis Crozier of Terror and Captain James Fitzjames of Erebus. They faced a situation that admitted no good options. The ships could not move. Provisions were diminishing. 24 men had died by the spring of 1848. Rescue was not coming. On the 22nd of April 1848, a note was left in a cairn at Victory Point on King William Island. It was written on a standard Admiralty form, originally deposited the previous year, with a routine message indicating all was well. Now the margins were filled with additional text, cramped handwriting recording what had changed. Franklin was dead. 9 officers and 15 men had perished. The ships had been deserted 5 leagues to the northwest. 105 survivors would start tomorrow for Backsfish River. The march began on the 26th of April, 1848. 105 men set out across the ice and tundra, dragging sledges loaded with supplies. The sledges were heavy, some weighed over 600 pounds. They carried tents, clothing, food, cooking equipment, navigational instruments, personal effects that men could not bring themselves to abandon. The route led south across King William Island, then across the frozen strait to the mainland, then overland to the Back River, which might carry them to Hudson's Bay Company outposts and Salvation. The men were already weakened before they began. Scurvy does not reverse itself without fresh food. Lead poisoning does not fade without removal of the source. The calories required to haul heavy sledges across Arctic terrain exceeded anything the remaining provisions could supply. The mathematics of the march were impossible from the start. On the third week, a Marine stumbled while crossing a ridge of broken ice. The sledge rope tightened across his chest, and for a moment he simply knelt there, breathing in shallow pulls that burned his lungs. No one spoke. The wind moved snow across his boots. A lieutenant stepped forward, lifted him by the arm, and for several seconds they stood facing one another, neither admitting what both understood, that strength was no longer something a man possessed, only something he borrowed from the group. When the sledge tipped later that afternoon, spilling tins and instruments into the snow, no one cursed. They picked the objects up slowly, as if handling relics from a world already lost. They moved slowly. The ice was rough, broken into pressure ridges that required constant effort to navigate. The sledges, caught on obstacles, tipped over, demanded energy that the men did not have. Rest breaks grew longer. Distances covered each day grew shorter. Food ran out, not all at once, but gradually, the rations shrinking, the tins emptying, the reserves consumed. Hunting provided little. The tundra in early spring held few animals. The men ate whatever they could find, lichens scraped from rocks, bones boiled for marrow, leather from their own equipment softened in water. Some collapsed and could not rise. They were left behind, covered with whatever could be spared, their companions continuing south, because stopping meant dying, and continuing meant the possibility, however slim, of not dying. The trail they left behind was marked with abandoned equipment, with sledges too heavy to pull, with the bodies of men who had reached their limits. Inuit oral traditions, recorded decades later, described encounters with the survivors, groups of men staggering south, thin and desperate, exchanging items for seal meat, continuing their journey with eyes that looked through rather than at the world around them. In one account, an Inuit family watched them from a rise above the shore. The strangers moved awkwardly, burdened by wood and metal in a land where survival depended on lightness. Their faces were hollow, their eyes unfocused. An exchange was attempted, metal tools for seal meat, but language faltered, gestures replacing words. The Inuit understood hunger. They did not understand why these men carried so much of what could not save them. When the strangers turned south again, they did so without looking back. Some Inuit reported finding bodies, finding camps where men had clearly died, finding evidence that suggested the survivors had consumed the flesh of the dead in their final extremity. Later expeditions would confirm this. Bones recovered from King William Island showed cut marks consistent with defleshing. The evidence was clinical and undeniable. The men of the Franklin expedition did what humans do when all other options have been exhausted. They survived as long as survival was possible, and then they did not. None reached the back river, none reached the trading posts, none sent word of what had happened. The 105 men who began the march in April 1848 died somewhere on the tundra, in ones and twos and small groups, their bodies scattered across a landscape that offered no shelter and no salvation. Erebus and Terror held their positions as the years passed, as search expeditions combed the Arctic, looking for traces of the lost men, as the Admiralty eventually declared all hands deceased. The ice shifted around the hulls, cracking and reforming with the seasons, but the ships endured. Built to withstand polar conditions, they withstood them, even as their crews perished on the frozen ground to the south. Erebus eventually sank near King William Island. Terror settled farther south, in a bay that would later bear her name, preserved by the cold in remarkable condition. Erebus rests where the current slows, her hull tilted slightly, her timbers darkened but unbroken. The cold preserved what discipline could not. Plates remain stacked, tools lie where they were set down. The ship did not fail, the men did. More than a century later, she was found beneath clear Arctic water, not triumphant, not ruined, simply waiting. Terror rests farther south, equally intact, equally silent. They endured the ice and the decades that followed. The passage Franklin sought can now be crossed. Engines hum where sails once strained. Satellites trace routes across waters that were once walls. But beneath those waters lie the remains of certainty, the belief that preparation is the same as control, that technology can negotiate with climate, that willpower alters mathematics. The ice does not negotiate, it holds. And when movement stopped in September 1846, it began a slow, patient, claiming that did not end with death, but with preservation. The ships remain, the ice remains. The men are gone,